Okay, hi everyone. We're going to do a video here on probability vocabulary. And the reason I'm doing this video is because we're starting a probability unit in our class, and there's a lot of new words that I'm going to be using, a lot of vocabulary that is important to understand because we're going to be using it all the time. So let's kind of just go through what some of these words are and what do they mean. And I would take some notes and write these down. So the first word I'd like you to write down is outcome. What's an outcome? And an outcome is something you want to happen, a consequence that's going to happen when you do something. So I'm going to write that as my definition. A consequence of an action. A consequence of an action. And when I talk about a consequence of an action, I'm thinking of things like flipping coins and rolling dice. When I flip a coin or I roll a dice, the consequence is what do I get? So if I flip a coin and I get heads, heads is my consequence. It's my outcome. Or if I flip a coin and I get tails, tails is my outcome. So when I'm talking about outcome, that's what I mean. What do I get when I'm doing my action? If I roll a dice and I roll a 6, 6 is my outcome. Kind of straightforward. That probably makes a lot of sense. You're probably like, well, that's easy enough. So that's our first vocab word. Our next vocab word is event. What's an event? An event is not a new word for you, but in the probability world, when I'm talking about probability, an event is a desired outcome from an experiment. I'm going to add that in there, from an experiment. So an event is a desired outcome from an experiment. A desired outcome means something you want. So if you're flipping a coin and you win the game if you get a heads, let's say, then you want heads. Heads is the event that you want. It's the desired outcome. So an event is a word you're going to be hearing me use a lot. Okay, so let's keep going through these words. We have outcome, we have event. The next word is sample space. Sample space. And we're going to talk about what is sample space. So sample space is all the possible outcomes of a situation. All the possible outcomes of a situation. So when I am flipping a coin, I'm going to keep using that as my example, there's only two possible things that can happen. You either flip and you get heads, or you flip and you get tails. So there are two possible outcomes. That's my sample space. Sample space is all the possible outcomes. So I think let's do this for our notes here. Since we're writing these out, I'm going to space this out a little bit better. And let's write in some examples in between here so that we can kind of show what we're talking about. So for outcome, let's make a little example under here, just so that we have something in our notes that at least can kind of help us a little bit. So we talked about an outcome being a consequence of an action. So if I roll a dice and get a 5, let's say, 5 is the outcome. I think we need some examples on here. So an outcome of rolling the dice would be rolling and getting a 5. 5 is the outcome. Alright, there's our first example. Let's do an example of what an event is. So example. What's an event? Okay, so an event is a desired outcome. Something that you want to have happen. So for instance, you're trying to win a game. So you win a game if you roll, let's say, an even number. So getting an even number, that's your desired outcome. That's your event. You'll win if you roll an even number. Sample space, let's do a little example of what sample space is, just so we have it for our notes. So sample space is all the possible outcomes of a situation, everything that could possibly happen. So I'm going to write for sample space, when rolling a dice, you have 6 possible rolls. 6 possible things that you could get, a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or a 6. That's your sample space. Rolling a dice, you have 6 possible roles, 6 possible outcomes is kind of the idea. Okay, so there's kind of our vocabulary: outcome, event, and sample space that you're going to hear me using a lot. Now let's try doing an actual example here. And our first example, example 1, we're going to kind of just come up with a little story here. So let's say we have a guy named James, and James flips a coin. So James flips a coin 30 times. What is the probability he will flip heads? What is the probability he will flip heads? Okay, so let's talk about how to do this problem. First off, he is flipping a coin 30 times. That's our sample space. That's how many times he's going to flip the coin. So if we have 30 flips, we already have kind of a number we can work off of. And we're trying to find the probability of heads. So probability, so P for probability. Then we make a parenthesis of flipping and getting heads. So I'm going to write probability of heads. It's easier to type than to write with this thing. Probability of heads. What's the probability of getting heads? Okay, well, it's going to equal a fraction. And on the bottom of the fraction, it's going to be all the total outcomes, all the possible events. So there are 30 times that he is flipping this coin. 30 times that he flips. So I'm going to write 30 times. And if he is to flip that every single time, the chances are he would get heads half the time. Tails on one side, heads on the other. So we're expecting 15 times that he would get heads. 15 heads. There we go. So 15 out of 30. Well, 15 out of 30, if I want to kind of simplify this down, 15 out of 30 is really a fraction equal to 1/2. We have a 50% chance, a half chance that we're going to flip heads. So I'm going to use my calculator here for a second, and 1 divided by 2, if we don't already know, which we do, is 0.5. So we're going to write equals 0.5. Which means my probability of getting heads, which I'm going to write that here, probability of, and I'm just going to make this easier and write heads, probability of heads equals 1/2 or 50% chance. 50% chance. Out of 30 flips, I expect him to get heads 15 times. Probability of heads. What I just did here is called a theoretical probability. I just calculated a probability using math. So we're going to write that over here. Theoretical probability. You should write those words down. Theoretical probability means mathematically I calculated what are the chances of getting heads. Out of 30 times, I probably will get heads about 15 times, 50% of the time. But I didn't sit here and flip a coin. I did not do that for 30 times. If I had sat here and actually flipped that coin 30 times and wrote it down, then I would have been actually going out and doing an experiment. But I didn't. I did no experiment. So theoretical probability is when I'm not doing any experiment. I'm just trying to figure out what are the chances. I'm calculating it mathematically. So let's do this. For the last little piece of our notes here, let's talk about the difference between what's called a theoretical probability versus something called an experimental probability, because these are two different things. Theoretical versus experimental probability. What am I talking about? So I'm going to draw a little line here and a line here. I'm just going to make a little table. I'm going to organize my work a little bit, and we're going to write in a definition. A theoretical probability is a calculated probability. I mathematically calculate and figure out a probability. So a calculated probability based on possible, so I would write this down, based on possible outcomes that each have the same chance of occurring. So theoretical probability is a calculated probability. I mathematically calculate it and figure it out based on possible outcomes that each have the same chance of occurring. When I flip a coin, you have the same likelihood of getting a heads as a tails. So the same chance of occurring. Now, an experimental probability is when I actually sit here and flip the coin and add it up. So that's when I actually go out and do it. So I'm going to say probability based on data collected through experiments. If I went out and flipped a coin 30 times and wrote down how many heads I got, that would be the data I collected, and that would be an experimental probability. So we have two types of probabilities we're going to be talking about. Theoretical, where we just talk about it and we mathematically calculate it, and experimental, where we actually go and do it. Actually roll the dice, actually flip the coins, or draw the cards out of the card pile, or spin the spinners. Whatever we're talking about, I actually go out and do it. That's experimental probability. Okay, so a lot of new words. I hope you kind of wrote them all down, and like I said, we're going to be using them in class a lot. So I hope this video helps a little bit. Thanks, guys.